Hi, everyone. It's David Edgar again with another episode of Talking Deals with David. And today we're going to be talking about, as if you don't know, I've been posting, I think, all week about it. We're going to be talking about people and M&A. And this one I'm really excited about because I'm joined by, I think, just two superstars who know a ton about people and about M&A, which is hard to find. So I've got my partner from our Raleigh office, Leanne Walsh. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, David. Great to
Hi.
be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I always appreciate that you're willing to jump on things like this with me. And Leanne does a ton of work with me, but all around our platform around the world on all kinds of labor and employment issues, including but not limited to M&A type work. So we'll talk to Leanne as we go, and then Jennifer Fondreve is the real superstar, I guess, of this LinkedIn Live. And Jennifer, I'm really happy that we finally were able to get this done. I think it was a couple months maybe in process, but it's nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited that you reached out, said, loved your book. Can we talk? And just very happy to be here.
And it worked. No, well, I tell people who ask me, why is a corporate M&A lawyer, from a large global law firm, doing these LinkedIn lives or doing all this LinkedIn posting? And this is exactly the reason. I don't remember how I came across your postings, I think on LinkedIn, but I came across the book, had to buy it, and loved it. And I thought
I
this is
noticed
really
it's
interesting.
dog-eared.
It actually is. Look at this. This actually shows that I have been going through it. Yeah,
I
that
should
actually
just
is
get off
right.
now. I just should get off now.
Right. No, that's exactly. Yeah, it's right. So no, I loved it, and you're right. I just reached out to you randomly, and I thought, wow, this is you're doing all kinds of things. I mean, it got a great website, all kinds of really cool writings that you do, and public speaking. So I thought, Jennifer's never going to respond to me. Who am I? I'm just sending this message saying, hey, would you like to maybe do a LinkedIn Live? And then we had a great conversation. But it's one of the terrific things I think about doing these LinkedIn, being on LinkedIn, and then doing these live type events. So no, I'm glad that you said yes, and that we're able to put this together and have a talk today.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine.
Yeah, it's great. Well, one thing that I was thinking about, Jennifer, was um, with this big SVB debacle that I think occupied probably Leanne's time, certainly a little bit of my time over the weekend. Um,
Yeah.
Thinking about people, but also thinking about sometimes what people say when they're in the middle of a stressful, tense situation. And what struck me about the SVB situation was, and I wrote about it a lot, there was a lot of things coming from their leadership team that I sort of, in a joking way, highlighted. Things like, there's nothing to see here. Everybody stay calm. Everything is fine. And of
Right.
course, things like that, at least for me, maybe I'm just more of a paranoid, M&A lawyer, make me want to dig deeper, look a little bit harder. And one thing that you said one time that I'd love to get your thoughts on is, in an M&A context, the equivalent to that, I think, is there's nothing to see here. Nothing's going to change.
Right.
Everything is going to be the same. And people seem to say that. Have you experienced that? And what's your feeling about those kind of statements that you hear when you're thinking about an M&A deal?
Well, that is the number one thing that I tell to leaders, CEOs, even private equity. When you're going through the M&A deal, the number one thing not to say is nothing is changing. It's all going to stay the same, because the reality is everything has already changed. And the faster you are transparent and talk about the fact that, hey, things are changing, but you play a role in the direction we go, and the ability to make those changes for the better. I did actually, on LinkedIn, I wrote an article about the top 10 things that executives say. And what's hysterical to me is when I show that list, everything from, nothing is changing to, um, you know, now we have an opportunity to be a full portfolio of offerings to our clients. And I talk about, well, what your frontline leaders actually hear is, what do you mean nothing's changing? Everything's changed. And when you talk about, we have a full portfolio of offerings to our clients now, what your frontline leaders hear is, well, what was wrong with what we had before? I've actually been our value proposition has been about how uniquely we serve the client, and now you're telling me we've got more. Now they're going to wonder, well, were we not the best offer before? So there's a lot of things that executives tend to say with good intentions, but that can backfire because they're interpreted differently than how they were intended.
It's interesting to kind of have that idea of what the person is hearing versus what you're saying. You actually have, I think in the book, it may have been someplace else. I think it's in the book. We do a lot of redlining, right? And what Leanne and I do every day in terms of marking up agreements. And you have this great little speech, I guess, that an executive is giving to someone, I think meant as a pep talk. And then you sort of mark it out like we lawyers
Yes.
would do. And it's really awesome. And it basically, this person was saying, you're going to have great opportunities. Your job's going to expand. And when you mark it out, it's fantastically funny, except if you're the hero of it. And basically, the only thing the person hears, everything else is sort of muted. All they hear is, you're going to have more work. You're going to be out of a job. It's all those
Right.
sort of like very scary things. And you don't think about that it is a very M&A at its essence is about people, and it's the people who conceive of M&A transactions, and people like Leanne and I who help to implement them, execute the transactions, and then everything else happens. And in order to get an effective transition over time and get the value that you anticipate, you just have all these different people that have to come and really align. It's a very challenging thing. Is that why executives or others may just downplay this or ignore it a bit until it's too
I
late?
think
It's too complex maybe to get your arms around?
I think again, the comments that come out of executives' mouths, I mean, often they're scripted, which equally can backfire, right? Because then you come across as inauthentic and not genuine, right? And your frontline leaders, everyone, the workforce can read between the lines. And in that particular passage, actually, it was for an article where I showed that what executives say and what your frontline leaders in particular, and I'm emphasizing frontline leaders because they're the ones who are not in the room when the deal is made, but who are burdened with the execution. So now suddenly they're handed the strategy and they've got to go out and make it work, but they weren't in the room to discuss it. So they get a barrage of communications. And the unfortunate reality with mergers and acquisitions is it comes with negative baggage. Even if someone hasn't been through it before, they've seen headlines on previous multi-billion-dollar M&A deals that haven't gone well. Maybe they had a friend or an uncle or one of their parents went through it. So it comes with negative baggage that I am continuously letting executives know who are about to embark on it. You have to know that you start at -10 as soon as you've announced this, because people are going to come to it with a lot of negativity. And so a big part of the communications is being authentic and genuine and transparent where you can be, in order to help people understand what the vision is, where this is going, and the role that they play. So that's why I say you're going to say a lot of things, but what people are going to hear is, do I still have a job? Am I still going to be with my same team? Will I even keep my vacation days? What seem to be basic things are immediately what people start to think about the moment they hear the news.
Well, one of the things, and that's why I invited Leanne to join us, that Leanne, your practice is, all about people, and you do a lot of different kinds of things, not just connected to M&A, but in the M&A world, we were talking a little bit about before we jumped on. How do you think about what you do on the legal side of deals in an M&A deal, and how do you interact with sort of the HR people that might be on the acquisition or the target side to kind of help them navigate what Jennifer described as a very stressful situation? They're doing their regular job. They've got this new job, which seems like a job, plus all the uncertainty that flows around that. How do you sort of conceptualize and think about your role on the legal side of that?
Right. So, agreed that I think having a people first mindset is really important as you go through the process. I mean, as attorneys, if we're doing diligence on a target, for example, yes, we're looking at handbooks and non-competes and wage and hour practices and trying to identify if there are any risks or compliance concerns. But we've got to work with target management and target HR as we go through that process. So, as you said, David, recognizing that it's very time consuming and stressful for them to do their regular job plus add handling M&A diligence on top and dealing with tons and tons of requests for information and then hopping on diligence calls. So trying to be thoughtful and appreciative of the work they've already done, the information they're trying to give us. You know, it's not often they're going to be trying to hide information. They're doing the best they can as fast as they can. And often the pace of transactions is just really challenging for anyone to keep up with. And so trying to be thoughtful about that as we go through the process. And then also making sure that, you know, if we do identify a concern on a diligence call, you know, there's no gasps or shock and awe about, you know, someone's made a mistake, not trying to get anyone fired. We're just trying to recognize and identify what the risks are. We can figure out how to address them in the transaction, and then we can work post-closing to help clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up. And so I think trying to make people feel at ease so they know that their competence is not in question, their credibility is not in question, their work ethic, and that we recognize what they're going through is really important part of what we do as we go through the work of just doing the diligence. And then I agree on the kind of integration side, helping them be thoughtful about messaging, whether that's new offer letters, new employment agreements, a welcome letter. Just like Jennifer said, people are worried about basic things like PTO, sick time. Well, what if I had a leave scheduled or I need surgery? What's going to happen with my benefits? All those types of things that maybe other executives don't realize are going to be just like the day-to-day little things that staff are going to be really unsettled by. And so making sure that all of that gets addressed in the messaging in a really clear and transparent and reassuring way, I think is helpful, because if you don't, what we see is employees sometimes will be so nervous and anxious, they will preemptively start kind of filing internal frivolous type complaints, thinking, well, if I blow the whistle on something, even if it's not really anything, now I filed a complaint so no one can fire me or I can't be laid off. And so you can see if people aren't sufficiently kind of reassured and transition smoothly right after a transaction, you can have a lot of people engaging in kind of toxic self-protection behaviors. So that's something we try to help clients guide through.
Yeah, and Jennifer, how do you? I know we had talked about this. You know, I'm starting to think more about this in sort of the M&A context because of what I do. You know, we're very focused, and Leanne is the same. We're very focused on sort of the legal aspects of getting a deal, you know, to signing and ultimately to closing. But what do you see in terms of where lawyers can work more productively with you, with clients, in terms of conceptualizing, understanding these people dynamics that are so important to making a deal successful? A lot of times we just don't think about that until after the closing, and then it's, you know, then it may be too late in a lot of these cases.
Well, and that's why I love that you invited me on to have this conversation with you and Leanne. The more that, and Leanne actually articulated a number of things, just the communication that goes out, understanding, because you've done this before, you see how people react, having that experience and bring that to each and every merger and acquisition deal that you might work on. Each is unique. So I always say that there's no standard playbook. You always have a framework for how you do things, but you have to understand people are individuals. Human nature means you're going to see a different side of people. But the more certainty that you can bring to what is automatically a very uncertain moment, what I always say to leadership is, it's not that people abhor change. Change can be jarring and it takes them a while to adjust, but what they really detest is prolonged uncertainty. And what I always use as a reference point is think about the pandemic. People slowly adjusted to change, but what drove everyone crazy was the uncertainty, the going back and forth, and where are we on this journey with the pandemic. And so I say the same thing happens. It's human nature. So where you can bring certainty, by all means do so. And I think the lawyers can play an enormous role in that. And thankfully, Leanne articulated a number of the ways that that can happen. And like I said, the other thing that Leanne highlighted, I think, is critically important is you're now tasking people with additional work beyond their day job. So you've got to factor that into your timeline. What I see happen too often is the timeline doesn't accommodate for the additional workload that people are going through. And we're continuing to see mental health crisis, burnout. So just imagine if we already have that dynamic happening, and then you're going through a merger and acquisition, and you are now tasking someone with additional work beyond what was already their day job. If you don't factor that into the overall timing, you aren't going to get the best work out of people.
Oh, it's a really great point, Leanne. I have to think more about that, better on the M&A side, because there's no reason that, that kind of an approach that you suggested and that Jennifer, seems to like also, can't be done even on the M&A corporate side of things, being a little more sensitive to how you frame requests, what sort of timing, maybe having some calls, directly where you have a chance to, express some of your understanding about what they're going through and some of the stresses that they're facing. I think that could be very helpful in, one, getting more realistic deadlines, timing, understanding sort of what the constraints are, but then also just making people feel, more comfortable. And the comments that we're getting, Ian, thank you for your comments. Very much agree, talking about strategy, communications, the approach. So I think, and Ian has a lot of experience in M&A and doing acquisitions and transitions. So that's great. And if other people do have comments, please, you can type those in, and then I'll try to, read those as Jennifer and Leanne are talking, and we'll try to answer those or loop those in as we need to. So Jennifer, what I love about your book and all the things that you do and you write is it has a very practical bent. And I know you didn't always kind of just start out being a, integration mastermind or something like that, or people integration person. You were doing, high level, like C-suite type marketing work, other things in big companies, and found yourself at various points on both ends of the M&A experience. And so is that what kind of gave you the thinking impetus to, hey, maybe there's a missing link that I can, provide some advice and guidance on?
Absolutely. It's very funny. I mean, my father still is a bit astonished at what I'm doing now, since I had a 25-year career in marketing and advertising and communications. But in going through 3 separate multi-billion-dollar deals, I just kept thinking, God, there's got to be a better way of doing M&A. And no disrespect to the consulting firms I worked with, but I felt that a lot of the consulting was just focused on efficiency and putting everyone in boxes and going through checklists. And where I felt that there was a gap was the emotional nature of mergers and acquisitions, the emotions that people can feel, particularly if you've got an organization where people have been with that company for a while and they've identified with that company. And now they're going through a merger or an acquisition. They are 2 separate events. They get thrown together. But in either case, you can go through such a significant change that you lose sense of your identity. And so I wanted to acknowledge that you can have a workforce that goes through the stages of grief. They're no longer certain what their future is. The familiarity of the people who they worked with, maybe that's changing too. But more often than not, what is the most, I want to say, crippling, what can hold people back is we all expect a certain future, particularly if you've been doing very well at the company and you've envisioned a certain path for yourself. And now suddenly all of that's called into question. And so the loss of that expected future, and in fact, I don't get credit for that. It was a CEO who I interviewed. I interviewed about 60 C-suite executives, including private equity, HR, CFOs, CEOs. And in one of those interviews, the CEO said he had witnessed his leadership and the workforce just being very emotional. about the changes that were taking place. And his mother was a grief counselor. And she said, well, that's because they're mourning they're mourning the future that won't be. They're grieving over the loss of that future. It's called ambiguous loss. And I thought that was exactly it. It was an epiphany moment for me as well. So I talk about the emotions that people can go through, and the fact that you might see changes in people. People who you thought you knew can act differently when they're afraid or uncertain of their future. And I didn't see anybody else talking about that or helping leaders be better leaders through those emotional times. And so that's why I embarked on the journey that I'm on now. It's why I wrote the book. It's why I now consult, and it's why I'm a speaker working with organizations to better understand what that journey is like, and how to be prepared for it and how to thrive through it.
Did you do better as you were navigating your own transitions through the M&A that you were involved in? Because you started doing this after the third one, I take it, so that you kind of had made it through those. Did you struggle in each of those, or did you look back and think, boy, I think you had written at one point, right? I wish I had this thing because I didn't really know what I was going through. So you didn't necessarily have the framework yet.
Yeah. It definitely, by the third one, when I said there's got to be a better way, it's because I struggled through each one. The first one, which I talk about in the book, I was the global head of B2B marketing for Navtech, a digital mapping company. And it was acquired by Nokia in 2008 for $9 billion. And I thought it was an amazing opportunity. I was very excited. I thought Nokia was being smart about acquiring us to make location how people connected. If you remember, Nokia was about connecting people through phones. And so I was excited about the opportunity. Don't need to waste time on the details, but the acquisition was not as successful as it could have been in that initial time frame. And so for me, that was kind of the first epiphany moment. And by the third acquisition that I went through, I've been on all sides. I've been acquired. I've been a part of a team where they were acquired and I inherited them. And then I've also been part of a company that was acquired by private equity. And in each scenario, I thought, if people just knew what to expect. In fact, actually, the joke title for my book before it became Now What was What to Expect When You're Not Expecting to Be Acquired. And really for me, that was it. It was just to paint a better picture, because leaders, they're different tools in your toolkit when you're leading people through times of change and uncertainty. It's not your standard toolkit. And I wanted leaders to not only know that, but to know what tools they needed to work with to better lead not just their teams, but themselves. Because that's what often is forgotten too. You're trying to figure out the strategy. You're trying to figure out your role in all of this. And then you're also trying to lead people. So you want to be conscious of that and support your leaders in doing that better.
Well, I want to actually, Courtney, Alana, and Brent, great questions and great comments. They're all kind of hovering around when you start thinking about a deal. And there's always that talk that, that lawyers, that Leanne and I will be involved in, where you'll talk about this day one. One of the things, and usually that's meant to be the closing. You close the deal.
Right.
You've from our side, Leanne and I hopefully are celebrating. We've also probably been, working 24 hours and for months on end. And so there's a lot of stress and tension on our side, on just the advisor side. And we're, hopefully having used to be closing dinners, back in the day, not so much anymore, but you'll have some celebratory calls. And we head off, and that's day one. But Jennifer, one of the great things that you talked about, and that the comments from Courtney, Alana, and Brent, I think kind of, hover around, is really day one in your mind is when the first executive gets the idea that they want to do a merger or an acquisition and start scoping out what that might look like. In your mind, that is day one. Is that right? And that's when you want to start thinking about how are the people going to fit? How are the cultures going to mesh? How do we address these stages of grief, that you that you kind of extract from that Kubler-Ross sort of approach. Is that right? So day one is earlier than our day one.
Right. And I love, I just wish I could hug you, David, because
Oh, well,
the fact
that's
that
even
you
better. Okay, well, that's great.
read my book, you've read all of these other things, a true devotee. So thank you. And that's actually why I called my company Day One Ready, because in working with executives, I'll say to them, here's the reality. The moment you start thinking about a merger and acquisition, even if you tell no one, you start to make decisions through that lens. And your people pick up on that. They'll notice, oh, David would typically not hesitate to make this decision. Why is he delaying decision making on this? And it's because that executive, you're thinking about, well, if I do a merger, you've got a number of things you're considering mentally that no one else knows, but they pick up on those cues. And so I'll say to executives, don't think that people aren't already hypothesizing what you're considering because of the way you're making decisions or actions that you're taking. So for me, highlighting that happens the moment you start thinking about it starts that timeline sooner. Because the moment that deal is announced, that's when I say you have to already have your communications plan done and ready to a lot of the things that Leanne highlighted. The more you have answers to questions and can bring certainty to what can be a very uncertain moment, the faster you can start to get your people on board. And as you highlighted, you've been working on this potentially for months, but now they're just hearing about the news. Even if there were rumors flying, different scenarios that people were playing out in their head, it's the moment that the news is announced that now their time frame starts. So even if they were entertaining it, now they've got to adjust and embrace it, and that takes time. So for me, it's where that timeline starts. And I wanted to emphasize the timeline starts the moment you start thinking about it, because people start picking up on that and then anticipating, oh, I wonder if he's thinking about a merger and acquisition, or particularly if it's been talked amongst leadership in the past. So you need to be prepared for that your day one actually starts much sooner than you think.
Leanne, when do you, how do you feel about that? And are you brought in on M&A deals fairly early in your mind, or do you feel sometimes maybe like I do, which is, it's too late? But how do you think about working with clients from the legal side once you sort of get that call? I guess it could come from someone like me if we're doing an M&A deal, or it could come from clients that you separately advise on various labor employment issues that they're working with. But how do you sort of think about your role working with clients through these challenging M&A deals?
Agreed that it can be quite a spectrum as to when I'm brought in. Ideally, the earlier the better, right? So if a client is thinking that it may want to be sold, then there's a lot we can do to help them get ready, even just to make the diligence exercise easier. One, we can do kind of a mock diligence exercise with them. We can say, hey, look, I've done this hundreds of times. I can tell you now all the questions they're going to ask, all the documents they're going to want. We can just do a little mini internal review, help you clean up anything that we need to. If you need to update your handbook, maybe it's been several years, there can be little things that we can just help do quickly to get you ready. And then also, I love when I get brought in at the LOI or letter of intent stage, because there's protections you can build in the letter of intent about how employees will be treated and protected post-closing. So you can get promises as early as the LOI that people will have, same pay, same benefits, be substantially treated the same as the other employees of the Inquirer. There's a lot of ways you can phrase protections, but you can work those in to the LOI, so then you don't have to make that another fight as you're going through the transaction document itself. And so, of course, once you've got those agreed, then we'll build it into the purchase agreement. But those are some things we can do on the front end if we're brought in early enough. If not, then it's more of a scramble, but we can still help try to make the diligence process as smooth, and then help negotiate the purchase agreement with those kind of human element in mind.
It's really great, Leanne. Actually, you mentioned that. I hadn't thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense that, I'm always thinking about from the legal side that, when you're on the sell side, the most leverage that you're probably ever going to have is right before you sign that LOI. especially if there's an exclusivity,
Mhm.
agreement as part of that, that you're not going to keep, shopping the company. You're going to focus exclusively on one particular buyer. Once you agree to that exclusivity period, your relative leverage most of the time tends to start dropping, and sometimes pretty precipitously. So thinking about early how you're going to give that kind of, I don't know if the right word is psychological safety, but it's actually just material safety, the feeling of well-being, the feeling that, the employees are being thought about. The key executives typically are always thought about, right? They've thought about their employment arrangements, their contracts, their incentives, but oftentimes it's the people that really make or break the success of the M&A, um, that are relegated, Jennifer, as you say, till way later. Julia, actually, I went back and found a comment that Julia made, her question, which I thought was a great one. And I think, Jennifer, this probably relates to you, but I'm going to actually have Leanne, after you kind of address it, maybe take it too. How do you do things differently, Jennifer, and how you approach your thinking around the people aspects of M&A? And Julia, one thing hopefully we already covered, I think one is just her day one approach, right? This thinking about it earlier. Don't make day one the closing, but think about it as when you first conceptualize the deal, and then using this emotional intelligence component that I think is often lacking in a business where you just are focused on numbers and spreadsheets and boxes to put people in. But Jennifer, what other ways do you think differently or do differently than maybe other people that focus on integration?
And I loved Julia's comment, and it's a fair comment. The first step that I took, though, was to shift people's mindset. Both Leanne and I have emphasized the same thing: start thinking about this sooner, right? Bringing you all in sooner. I think there's this um, perception around deals that there's got to be so much confidentiality. We can't bring anyone in until a certain date, but that then means there's oftentimes a scramble. Right now, you're overtaxing people. You're making requests, and you're burdening them with work where they don't always do their best work, because now they're, again, it's a scramble. So I think first and foremost, just shifting the mindset of the sooner you start preparing these things and thinking about bringing in experts like lawyers, like a human capital advisor, you're setting your deal up for success. So to me, that mindset shift is critical. But to Julia's point about, with more specificity, what are certain things that we can do? One thing that I do a lot with executives is a pre-mortem. And so they're essentially, the leadership is walking down the aisle. The deal is about to be consummated. And I'll say, okay, let's scenario plan. What are all the ways that this deal could go wrong, right? We know a post-mortem, the patient has died, and we work back to see, well, why did that happen? In a pre-mortem, you're scenario planning, and you're looking at the ways that something could go wrong. What will be the challenges that we might face? And in that case, I try what I call a reverse SWOT, right? What are the threats that could negatively undermine the success of the deal? A government policy comes out. Your competition moves faster on a product, or they come out with a product you weren't even anticipating. How might that affect the deal? Then what are things internally, right? Is there key talent we're assuming is going to stay on and be overjoyed that might walk? What would we do? And I say in those pre-mortem planning sessions, I'll always remind them, think about the military. It's why the military do drills. They want to be prepared for every possible scenario on the field, in the hopes that they will only face a few of them, but they're prepared for a variety of scenarios. And with me running those pre-mortem exercises, it's fascinating to me how oftentimes leaders say, I never would have done this on my own, but the fact that we did this gives me comfort that not only do we have some plans or some ability to see ahead into the future, but now I know how members of the team think. Now I see how they're going to approach the problem, how they're going to think about it. They've brought up things I never would have even anticipated or thought of. And so, to Julia's question, that exercise alone just is a way to help bring more certainty to uncertainty. And that's what I'm really trying to do, whether I'm helping leaders just be smarter about how to lead people, through times of change, helping them even look into the future, what might play out. That there's more that you can do around that than I think typically is assumed, and that's what I'm trying to do through my own experience, is helping people see through to what could happen and be prepared for it.
See, and Leanne, that would be a great, assuming you're doing that, let's say on the acquirer side, as part of maybe even very early, maybe in preliminary stages of diligence. But I could see that being very beneficial, for you to sit in or be involved in, because some of those threats, might be items that you could, think about dealing with through a legal lens, perhaps, or maybe you're even anticipating. You can add some things that you're thinking about in anticipation on, new government regulations or new ways of thinking about things. But how does that? Is that an area that I know your approach is very holistic? I think, like when we've worked together, what I like is, not only do you have great knowledge about, the technical legal side, but you, like Jennifer, I think, are thinking about, these things in a much broader context, and sort of the emotional elements that go into, the work that you do. But what do you think about that piece of it?
Yeah, I do think that's really important, especially with respect to key talent, thinking proactively about retention, incentives that you may want to offer, understanding that people might be unnerved. They might think that the career path they envision for themselves is no longer going to be available, or going to be much longer path than they thought, or they were expecting something that's not going to be available to them in terms of bonus or compensation anymore due to the changes. So planning for that, I think, is really important. And again, that's not necessarily legal, right? There's no law you have to give a retention bonus to anybody, but you may want to do that from a business perspective and a human capital perspective, and we can help you put those in place. And I always think trying to help clients focus on, carrots rather than sticks. If they're concerned about people leaving and thinking, oh, well, let's do really aggressive non-competes, and let's, have all these forfeiture and liquidated damages and just terrify people into staying. And I mean, is that the workforce you want? No, right? You're trapping someone into your workforce who doesn't want to be there, who's actively disengaged, can be so much more harmful than having to find someone to fill that spot. So I think thinking about incentives and retention, and managing those emotions for your team as they're going through the process is really important. And yes, there's lots of legal tools, but ultimately trying to think through what you're aiming to get at and the results you want to achieve, ensuring you have a really engaged workforce who does believe they have a long-term future with the company post-transaction.
Well, Alana actually asked a question, and I think maybe this is where we'll find a little bit of tension. So far, we haven't had any tension. I've been offered a hug, which is outstanding.
Violent agreement.
Yeah, so it's been great, but I think where the lawyers may get into a little tension is, I think, Jennifer, and you can correct me if I'm misreading it. You would like to start this process very early. That's building on that day one being when you first think about it. From the legal side, you're probably going to run into a lot of people. We don't have any of my antitrust colleagues on, but I've had we've had a few of these before, and from their perspective, you've got all of these anti-competitive restrictions that the antitrust laws have. You've got just the natural desire on the part of, let's say, a seller not to get leaked that they may be the target of an acquisition. There may be public company securities law issues and all kinds of things. So there's this tension that I've experienced on every deal, which is the buyer wants to sort of get moving and meet some of these people and talk with them, and maybe much more deeper in the organizational structure than just two or three, key executives at the top. But doing so is really challenging. It may actually be a violation of law to do it, depending on whether you're tough competitors or not. But it gives a lot of risk to both organizations if it sort of gets out. So, and this goes to Alana's point, when you're doing these SWOT analysis, pre-mortems, I assume they're just with one side. Is that right? So you might do it with the acquirer, team if you're advising them, or do it with the sell side. Is that right? Or are they somehow groups of both together doing that?
I've done it with leadership. As I said, it's you, the LOI sign, you are literally walking down the aisle. It's, you know, we're finalizing the document. So it's within that time frame. And ideally I'll do it with just the senior leadership from both sides to talk through. So I have done them, but I do want to say I am absolutely sensitive to the fact that you've got to be smart about the timing of these things and where you can, because I actually have also had the opportunity to, because both sides have signed, you know, non-competes, the confidentiality, all of that is there, that they have the ability to then bring in certain senior leaders from potentially the acquired company, have them equally sign documentation to just be able to have those conversations and line of sight within the company, so there aren't surprises. So I absolutely agree. You need to take proactively steps so that you're not exposing the information to a broad amount of the organization, but at the same time, you're able to get insights on how the organization runs, who the real key leaders are. Oftentimes, you know, when you've got those people on the front lines who really know how the work gets done, having those conversations gives you the ability to better see into the operation. So for me, it's an understanding. I'm married to a lawyer, so I recognize the importance of that. But
Yeah.
there are ways to do it so you have those insights that can be critically important.
Well, another thing that we didn't mention yet, going again to Julia's point, is or what differences you have, created this just amazing. And I'm curious, maybe we'll have it for a separate discussion. I'm curious because I'm very into like creativity and how make creative leaps. You were able to sort of create these characters that you run into in an M&A deal. And these can emerge at various stages, but certainly after a deal closes, you'll probably run into all of these. And and even though I haven't gone through an M&A myself, I certainly recognize some of these
You
characters.
lucky man.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are scary, so you have to be careful with a lot of them. But first of all, who does your sketches for these characters? I know you're multi-talented, but are you actually doing those, or do
No.
you have somebody that does those?
I almost feel like I should lie now and say, yes, I illustrated my book. But no, in fact, through my advertising career, which I loved, by the way, I loved working in advertising. I worked with an art director, very talented man named Jeff York. In fact, he and I were on the interview circuit right at the beginning when I first launched my book, because I really wanted to promote who I just think he's such a talent. And what's fascinating to me, David, is I had those illustrations before I even finished the book. And I would take all 10 caricatures from the book and show them, if I was interviewing a CEO or someone in private equity or an HR leader. All I had to do was show the picture. I didn't even have to say the title of the caricature. And people would say, oh my gosh, I know who this is. I've had experience with that person, right? And so for those people who are listening who haven't read the book, I have everyone from the know-it-all and the know-nothing, the opportunist, the missing in action, which today I think would be called your quiet quitters, people who are just disengaged and waiting to see how things play out. I'll have the great unifier, that person who everyone admires, who can be a great galvanizer of the workforce. And I also have, some of the more I don't want to say diabolical, but I've got the dominatrix, who is the bully. That's the person who's just focused on the objectives and not the people. And each of these characters, by the way, I highlight in the book and always want to reinforce, they are caricatures intentionally. I wanted to just humanize again that when people are afraid and uncertain of the future, you can see a different side of them. And I wanted to just bring that to light. I know I was several of those characters through my different M&A deals. And so you always want to just remember that people are people. And so that was the big overarching intent with that. But I also wanted to just highlight, you may deal with a couple of these characters, and here's how to identify them. Here's how to work with them. And here's how not to become one.
Well, here's the one that Leanne self-identified. I'll see if I can, before she told me. This is the one. I don't know if everybody can see that, but
The great unifier.
That's the great unifier. And Leanne, I think you said that sort of, at least aspirationally,
Yep.
that's who you do. And I thought, Jennifer, I thought you also sort of self-identified as the great unifier. Why am I on the outs there? I don't think anybody would say I identify as the great unifier, but maybe there's still hope. I'll continue to look at that. Some of the other characters I think I may have identified with maybe slightly more, but then again, I might have.
I mean, he's the rock star, of course. We don't know David is there, but not the former rock star. He's
right. I didn't want to be. I don't want to be a former rock star, but I did identify that. But I think there might be a little know-it-all there. There might be a little specialist. A few of them, as I was going through, struck me that, oh, maybe that's me, but not always bad, right? As you say, Jennifer, it's not that they per se bad. It's just that those are, caricatures of what you may find, and their strengths and weaknesses, with each of those approaches. Even the unifier, right? There's weaknesses to that approach too. But the other question, so I know who does it. You saw I was trying to get into a little bit of art. I don't do that, but my fiance Victoria helps me. I have to say, I corral her into trying some of these, doing some of these little art things for me. I don't know if people appreciate those or not. It's like, why is this, person from this big law firm doing these little pictures?
Absolutely.
But I've been trying to add a few of these little art things. So I noticed that they weren't nearly as good as yours. But the other question is, how do you bring these large posters when you're traveling around to do these things? Because one of the great things for people that, if you need to get on YouTube, or maybe it's even on your website, Jennifer, but one of the great things is it looks like when you're doing these fantastic on-site sort of things, you appear to be surrounded by these large posters of these characters. And then I noticed afterwards, you'll have some of the team members who probably were doing these SWOT analysis stuff, holding characters maybe they identified with. But how are you getting those things around? They look quite sizable.
So I'm paying off baggage at American Airlines, the baggage guys. I'm trying to stick fragile because I've got a little carrying case. But I do that intentionally, David. If I get any credit for creativity, it's having the idea to illustrate those 10 characters. I also illustrated the stages of grief. It's got a Spotify playlist, but for me, the creativity came from, how do I help reinforce the point that people are not line items? They're an asset for sure, but they're people. And I felt that the best way to do that is to, in my talks, right? I actually have the audience help me bring to life some of the characters. They'll read a description and we'll talk about, okay, so who is that? And we do kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You ask the audience, phone a friend. But what the benefit of that is, what I've seen is in the audience, they recognize, oh, I know one of those. I know the know-it-all. And we'll talk about how might a know-it-all undermine the success of the deal. And in one example I highlight where there was both sides coming together, and there was a know-it-all, and one person from the acquired company said, well, if you know everything, then why'd you acquire us? Right. And a know-it-all can undermine collaboration because people shut up. They shut down. And so we'll talk about how the negative side of this character can undermine the success of the deal. But how do you bring out the positive? Right. So the know nothing, people laugh and say, well, who's the know nothing? And I've always had someone say, oh, I know this one guy. Everyone thought he knew nothing. But actually, as I got to talk to him, I found out that he knew everything about the company because people opened up to him. They shared insights with him. So he knew everything that was happening at the company in a way that beyond what the documents provided to the private equity firm. And so for me, the willingness to carry those boards around the country, it's driven by the fact that it helps bring to life that we're dealing with people.
It's great. I mean, and it shows again just a much different approach to what I think a lot of people view as sort of a very dry, technical, lots of org charts with, boxes that you're moving around, or, spreadsheets with all kinds of different, calculations of synergies and dyssynergies and all these different things. This is a much more, I think, engaging approach to thinking about it, which is one reason I really loved it. And Leanne, you and I've talked about this before, but like, to me, that's one of the things I'm trying to do on these LinkedIn Lives, but also just LinkedIn generally. Like, lawyers in particular, and maybe M&A lawyers, but lawyers that work at larger firms. It's a very, it's serious business, and obviously people expect you to take it that way. But sometimes being able to communicate with people in different ways is actually more effective. And there's so much psychology I've learned over the years that go into what I do in terms of negotiating deals and thinking about structuring deals. And so having these kind of discussions, to me, makes a world different, because I learned so much. I mean, that your book, Jennifer, was just fantastic. But also for people who just watch the YouTube things, go on your website, you can take a personality, type test, right, that identifies the type of character that you might be. And you can see just the passion that you have for what you're doing, but it's done in such a, fun and engaging way that I imagine that, for a lot of people that makes it click a little bit better, which I assume is, the ultimate goal of what you're doing. And since you're talking about people, I imagine it's nice to actually, be a good people person and be able to talk like that. So were you always like that? Is that the way you were when you were chief marketing officer, with telling, marketing campaigns, or is this something that sort of developed as you've been doing more of this writing and doing the work that you're doing on site with clients?
Well, it's a very fair question. I never anticipated I would be doing what I'm doing now. I was marketing and advertising. Initially, I wanted to be ambassador to France, but that's a whole other career path. But it was in making this leap. I just had the book idea. By the third acquisition, I thought, I've just got to write this book. But I still plan to be a chief marketing officer. But as I was interviewing for the book and talking to CEOs, in particular, they would always say, well, what are you doing besides the book? This is really powerful information that needs to get out into the hands of people who need it. And the book alone wouldn't do it. And I recognize that. And what I am so thankful for and overwhelmed by is because I approached it with such creativity. I work very well with people with their playbooks and their frameworks and their charts and their templates. I just fill in the gaps. My goal always is, yes, you absolutely need that playbook, but let's just talk about human nature. It's unexpected. You think about during the pandemic, you probably saw a side of people you didn't expect. People react differently to change and uncertainty. And so my goal is to always bring that to light, but into Julia's question earlier, with as much specificity as possible, right? The stages of grief, why does that happen? And how do you get people through it? The caricatures were intended to say, you may see a different side of people, but that's not bad. It's just human nature. So here's how you help people through this time. And that's really my goal with this. It's what I was looking for when I was a leader through 3 separate M&A deals. And so thankfully, I've had the opportunity to do that with more and more companies.
Yeah, it's really great. Leanne, how did you get, like, I've always noticed that about you. You very much have, everybody has their own personalities. You have a very particular approach, which I think blends, really well with, what Jennifer's vision is. But did you kind of develop that as you were practicing, or is that kind of an approach that you always had as far as how you wanted to integrate your work with labor and employment, with, your interest in people and sort of being that, great unifier? How did that all come together for you?
It's really what drove me to want to be a lawyer in the first place. I interned in a legal department of a public company my senior year of high school. And so I got to try the full spectrum, whether that was transactional, IP, contracts, securities. But I just found the thing I loved the most was the whistleblower hotline, and just seeing kind of the variety of things employees would call and be upset and worried about. Some could be very serious legal in nature. Some could be, oh, my yogurt's missing out of the fridge, or I missed the bus today. I mean, the things people would call in for, it was just great. And so just seeing, I think, early on, kind of the spectrum of, you know, humanity in the workplace, I just thought, okay, if I do employment law, every day will be different. There's always going to be something new. I can really help people by doing this, but do it in a really kind of sophisticated way that's intellectually challenging, as you know, that I loved. And so that's kind of just what drew me to be a lawyer in the first place. So it's been a long path, but I love that I can have M&A as such a large component of my employment law practice, because then you really are working, you know, to help clients build things together and impacting the lives of, you know, thousands and thousands of employees every year.
Yeah, it's great, and it comes across, and you know, and your clients are lucky to have you, and obviously we're lucky, especially on the M&A side, to have you help us with our transactions, because I've been seeing that the people aspects are becoming much more critical. They always have been. Maybe it's just that, you know, I'm cluing in on it, or clients of ours are cluing in on it. It's easy to focus on, you know, sort of the financial statements and other things that might be a bit easier to get your arms around. So the people aspects, and having someone, you know, with your expertise and also sort of the humanity and the love that you bring to the work, I think makes a big difference. So, Jennifer, I guess as we're wrapping up, I just am so happy that you did this, because I really think for people that are watching, especially the lawyers out there who might not ever have thought about this, I think it's just so obvious. I knew the second we talked that, you know, your energy and passion for this and excitement about what you do just comes across. And so I think it's just fantastic. I'm really happy that you were able to talk with us, and I learned a ton. So I imagine everybody else did also.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure. I love the comments that Leanne made. You know, it's very true. The lawyers within deals have a significant role. And the one point that I wanted to highlight that Leanne made that I think is so important is fostering an atmosphere where people aren't ridiculed or shamed for a mistake. Because you're taxing people a lot when you're asking of this extra work. And Leanne made that comment of, you know, creating that environment. And I just, it's worth highlighting how important that is, particularly early in these stages, because, you know, people are working really hard when you're preparing for a deal. And that's what it's about, right? Helping people be at their best. So I love that you wanted to have this conversation, David. I knew we would get along.
Well, we did, and it was great. We definitely might, you know, have to do a part two or something. But I thought this was fantastic. I am going to think a lot harder about, you know, how you can help clients of ours, but also just, you know, thinking more about the points that both you and Leanne made, because I think it's so easy, especially when you're doing the M&A side work that I'm doing, to get divorced from that, and you don't necessarily feel that. I mean, you feel your own stress and tension and, you know, difficulties of doing a deal, but to really step outside that has been great. And that's why I just loved, you know, your book and your writings. And so everybody, you know, please check Jennifer out. You're still very active on LinkedIn, right? And then obviously your website has lots of really great stuff too.
I am active on LinkedIn. It's been an amazing platform for me to reach people. It's how you and I connected, and it's an opportunity to just show there's a different way of doing mergers and acquisitions. So please do, for those who joined us today, reach out to me on LinkedIn or connect with me on my website.
Okay, great. And yeah, thanks for all the comments too. There were so many, you know, great ones that I thought, you know, hopefully I tried to tie those in as much as we could. Niv, thanks for joining us. We did actually a LinkedIn Live, one of my earlier ones, I think, on the more the technical side of integration, and that's what Niv does and is great at doing that. And we were talking a bit about some of the antitrust issues, Jennifer, that we mentioned. But anyway, this was really fantastic. Jennifer, thank you so much. And Leanne, thanks for, you know, taking a shot, doing one of these LinkedIn Lives with me. It's really great. You're terrific. And I hope everybody, you know, enjoyed this, and definitely drop what you want to talk about. And then next week I'll be doing another one. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.